nos acompaña en este momento el profesor Esteban Moro, profesor visitante justamente del MIT. El profesor Moro es investigador y científico de datos de la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid en España y profesor visitante del Media Lab del MIT. Adicionalmente es investigador de la Universidad de Oxford, nativo de Salamanca en España, es doctor en física y profesor asociado del Instituto Mixto de la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. Profesor Moro, bienvenido al espacio, lo escuchamos. Adelante.
Muchas gracias, Emerson. Bueno, yo no sé si me oís bien.
Sí, lo oímos perfectamente, sí, señor.
Muy bien. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por contar con mi presencia hoy. Bueno, yo hablo español, así que sí, y también inglés. Voy a hacer, por consideración con las personas que están en el panel, voy a hacer la charla en inglés. Pero porque las transparencias están en inglés, pero voy a poder responder a las preguntas también en español, si hubiera alguna. Muchas gracias por la introducción. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Creo que las vemos. Bueno, un poquito de introducción de quién soy yo. Let me switch into English. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Esteban Moro. I'm a professor here at MIT, but also back in Spain and UC2M. And a little bit of context. I'm coming from, my background is basically a data scientist. So we have been working with these big data sets and collaborations with companies that have all these big data sets to try to understand human behavior in humanitarian settings. And I'm going to present today a little bit of perspective of what we have been doing, what is the kind of things that you can do, what is the kind of questions that you can ask the data, obviously, and pretty much related to the final part of Patrick's talk. I'm going to try to tell you what are the problems that this data has and the implications of using this data in settings in which typically the data has low quality, has a lot of drift, and has a lot of biases. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit what we're coming from. I come from something which is known as computational social science. The idea of computational social science is that we can understand something about the situation of people, like for example, their income, their health, the job status, for example, a disaster, a natural disaster, a humanitarian crisis, etc., by looking at on some data that comes from mobile phones, social media, but also that comes from, for example, credit card, etc. The idea behind computational social science is that this data reflects something about the behavior of people. And what I mean by behavior of people is how we interact with other people, like social behavior, how many connections we have, the content that Patrick was talking about in the previous talk. I mean, we can extract what is their opinions, for example, about something. We're looking at social media, and pretty much most of you probably use social media for the same thing. We can also understand, for example, what is the traffic of information through the platforms. We can also look at how people move around, and that tells us something about the situation. You can imagine, for example, that people could be coming from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. They have very different social connections. They have very different mobility. They talk and they speak and they relate to different subjects, so they have very different context, and that is reflected in the observation. So the idea of computational social science is that we can actually have like a real-time, almost population-wide survey in which, by looking at the data that comes from social media, from credit cards, from mobile phone, we can ask questions to these people. That's the ideal situation. But obviously, I'm going to mention that this has a lot of problems. So basically, the idea of computational social science is going from the right-hand side of this plot to the left, to go into the behavior and the situation of the people. One good thing that has happened in the last 20 years is that technology is catching up. I mean, like the computational social science revolution has been possible because more and more people have access to technology. Of course, there is still situations in which the access to technologies is still hard. I mean, there's, for example, Here I'm showing you the mobile phone subscriptions per 100 people in different areas in the world. And you can see, for example, that in the 2000s in Europe and Central Asia, we reached the number that more than 100% of the people, more than 100% devices, more than 100 devices by 100 people. And there's still some regions, like, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, in which still today the numbers are below 100. So that means that even the technology has really been more and more accessible to people, there are still some regions in which access to technology is still behind. And obviously the question is that in those regions, the access to technology is still very unequal. So most of the people which are more vulnerable and that typically are more affected by humanitarian crisis have less access to technology. But still, I mean, we can see that the numbers, especially in most regions in the world, are above 100, meaning that most people have a mobile phone. It could be a feature phone, it could be a smartphone, but they have access to mobile phone. On the right-hand side, you have another aspect of technology which has been well used in humanitarian settings, which is, for example, the resolution of satellite imagery. So I'm pretty sure you know that right now we can have almost a picture with 1 meter resolution of all the parts in the world daily. And that has been possible because during the last 20 years, there has been many companies launching their own satellite nets, satellite meshes. For example, Elon Musk is one of the, there are many companies, and Elon Musk is one of them. And they're launching these satellites that can picture different parts of the world and resolutions which are unimaginable right now. And also that this is the image resolution, but I can also tell you about the price, and the price to get those pictures is becoming very, very cheap nowadays. And that creates the possibility to observe areas which are very remote or areas which are very large with resolution which is meters. So technology is enabling the access to information that was not previously available, or that if you want to, for example, deploy a survey of in very far away areas, that can be complemented with this technology, or this data coming from these technologies, which can help you to, for example, monitor those areas which are needed, which are, for example, needing more these surveys, or complement those surveys with this data. I'm going to talk today about a particular set of data and a particular technology, which is the mobile phone. And very recently, the mobile phone, especially the smartphones, have become one of the main sources of data for computational social science. There are many different data that come from mobile phones, not very different resolutions, temporal and spatial resolutions. And then we have been working on all of them. And let me just briefly mention the technology. So one technology that has been used for a while, and for a while I mean more than 20 years, more than 30 years, is what is called CDR. CDR is basically the call detail records. Every time you make a phone call, the mobile phone has to connect to an antenna, and that antenna is geolocalized. You know where the antenna is. So by placing a call, basically I know where people are, and with a resolution that is typically from 100 meters in urban areas to 1 kilometer in very rural areas. And that is actually something that it's mostly in most countries. Unfortunately, in developed countries, people don't make calls anymore. I mean, there's a lot of people using social media and a lot of people using instant messaging, but not placing calls. But still, in developing countries, there's still a lot of people relying on making calls. And typically, the frequency in which people make mobile phone calls is about 30 minutes on average. So that means that we have more or less, I'm talking about a large fraction of the population which is geolocalized at the level of 1 kilometer and more or less around 30 minutes. You can imagine that this is an important data set to understand, for example, flows of people in the daily lives, migrations, and even, for example, what happens in vulnerable situations, like, for example, natural disasters. And this has been used. It's already used. There are many companies which are using this data to help humanitarian organizations in these specific settings. There's another data set, which is the one I have in the left, that comes from the GPS. And most of the smartphones, they have GPS data, which means that whenever an application, like for example, think about the weather application that you have on your mobile phone, whenever the weather application needs to provide you information, which is geolocalized, they use the data coming from the GPS that the mobile phone has, and that data is stored and used by the application, and it geolocalizes you typically with a precision that is around 5 meters to 20 meters. Also, it depends on the geography, depends on the whether it's a rural or urban, but typically it's about 20 meters. And most of these applications run in the background, like for example, Google Maps or the weather application, etc. So they typically provide a geolocation of people around 10 to 25 minutes. So this is actually very precise. It allows you not to see whether you are in an area, like for example, CDRs tells you that you are, for example, today in the north part of Bogota. The GPS will allow you to know exactly which street you are visiting, or even the business or the building that you are visiting. And then on the extreme, let's say, side of the technology is the Bluetooth technology, which is basically when you open your Bluetooth, you basically are scanning for other Bluetooth devices around, and that technology allows you to see whether there are other Bluetooth technologies around 1 meter to 10 meters. So it's really like you can even see people which are facing you, and that technology has been used, for example, in contact tracing applications during the COVID-19, just to see whether you got in contact with other people and to study the possibility, to monitor the possibility, or to trace the possibility that you got in contact with someone that was infected. So you see that different resolutions, different time and spatial resolutions. Also, I'm not gonna get into that, but different providers and different companies and different markets have different players in all of this. But depending on the problem that you have in mind and depending on the situation that you have in mind, some data could be more useful and some data could be more accessible and ready to be used. Let me tell you that we have been working on the mobile phone data technology for a while, and we have organized during the last 15 years a conference which is called MedMob, in which we have been partnering with agencies, typically United Nations, UNICEF, and Data Pop Alliance, and other organizations come to these conferences, but also census and statistical offices from many countries come to this conference, and also companies which are working on this mobile phone data. And we have also partnering with the data mobile phone operators. For example, we have the luck to organize 2 challenges during the NetMob with Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, Costa de Marfil, Ivory Coast, in which the mobile phone operators were giving us data for a challenge in which we exploited that information to many different problems, and people were actually building applications of that data for estimation of crowds, for the spread of the disease, for privacy, product adoption, marketing, for economic problems, for mobility, and for understanding cities. So there's a huge variety of people that has been using this mobile phone data for many different things, and of course, especially, and there has always been a number of participants in these conferences which are involved in humanitarian crisis, natural disasters, and humanitarian settings. So I highly recommend that you go through the proceedings to see. In the last conference that we organized, we have around 200 communications and people from all over the place. They come from Africa, from Malaysia, etc. One of the good things that we learn in organizing these conferences is how we can actually interact with data mobile phone data providers, also with satellite, also with social media providers, how we can set up these data collaborations, and especially one of the things that was most important in these conferences is to learn what are the privacy constraints and the trust questions that are needed to solve in order to get a sustainable and important use of this data in humanitarian settings. But let me tell you some, for example, some of the examples, some of the applications that we have been doing with this data. And I'm just going to refer here to things that we have done in the past. For example, one of the things that you can do with this data is to monitor the movements of people around the different areas. This is actually Spain. For those of you, this is the map of Spain. We have been using, for example, this data coming from social media to understand the movements of people in Spain, but not only the movements, but what people were saying on the social media using NLP, like the previous speakers were using. We can use NLP in social media. We can actually understand a lot of the subjects that people are talking. And by using what people were saying, NLP, and also the movements of people, we built a model a long time ago in 2005 that were able to predict unemployment of different areas by using this data. It's very simple. More diverse movement is associated with more economic activity, and that relates to less unemployment. But for example, more grammar issues in social media was related to less education and more unemployment. So we were able to find a model that was good to predict unemployment. And there has been a number of researchers that has been using this model to extend it to predict unemployment in settings in which traditionally you don't have this data. Because in Spain, you don't need to predict unemployment because there's an agency that produces this data every month, very fine grained. But for example, there are some people that have been using to predict unemployment in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in areas in which traditionally the data about employment is not so frequent, and most of the times is not so sophisticated or not so has not the resolution needed to implement policies. One of the good things about working with this big data is that you can always work on the one dimension, which is I want to actually get more resolution, more frequent or more precise, let's say, answer to the question of how many people are unemployed. But for us, the most interesting question was that even though we get a very good understanding of employment in Spain, actually what we found is that the error that we found in the model is associated with informal economy. So basically, the official data is not able to respond to the question of informal economy, but by looking at the data that we get from Twitter and for social media, we can actually understand the deviation between what we found in the social media, the real movements of people, and the official data actually inform us about the informal economy. So this is what we like in our group about big data. It's not about answering questions which are already there. It's actually asking questions that you cannot access by looking at official data, because official data, I mean, although you can actually ask people are working in the informal economy, most of the times the data is not, I mean, people don't answer very honestly to those questions, but the movements of people are a very honest signal of that question. The other thing that you can do with this big data is to try to actually answer questions globally, worldwide. Like, for example, this is a project that we did with Facebook data, in which using the API that they have for marketing, we could actually see the digital gap of access to social media in all the countries in the world. Actually, well, in most populated countries in the world, actually in 217 countries. So the good thing about this project is that you are not relying on a small survey. You can actually go to countries which traditionally are not, in which surveys are traditionally scattered or have low resolution. And with the Facebook Digital Divide, the Facebook Digital Divide project that we did, we can answer the question about how female and male participation in social media was, which are the countries in which this participation is more equal, and in which countries participation of women is catching up, or in which countries participation of female is actually going down. And we found that, for example, that you can see the map on the right-hand side, the areas which are marked in red. There's a huge gender divide in the access to social media, and we can traditionally see places that are, like, for example, sub-Saharan countries, also places like, for example, Saudi Arabia, or the countries in the peninsula, in the Arabic Peninsula, and also India and Pakistan. These are the countries in which women are actually have less access to social media, but at the same time, they have other, we saw that this is actually related to other type of gender inequalities that are, for example, income, education, and health. So that's the good thing. That's the good thing about having this data, is that you can try to understand which policies in which countries are working, and you can actually build real-time tools. We have a tool that is actually looking in real time how is this access to social media and how is this evolving in time. Another thing that you can do is you can study another digital divide, which is not just access to technology, it's not just access to social media, for example, it's how people are actually using the internet. It's not only access to internet. This is something that we just did last year, in which we studied not the first digital gap, not the first digital divide, which is the different access of different people to internet, but the second one, which is the different usage, the different use that people do when they have access to internet. So this is actually something that we did in France, but we are extending the analysis to other countries, in which people in France typically have access to internet. So the access to internet is not really a problem, although there are some areas in France in which the digital gap, the digital access is still a problem. And what we saw is actually that people of different incomes use internet in a different way. The people which are poor see a completely different internet than the people that are rich. And for example, people that are poor have more social media, more Facebook, more YouTube streaming, more access to, for example, streaming and in videos, etc. While people that are living in more rich areas, more educated areas, they use internet more for news, for searching, for email, for Google searches, etc. So you see that these differences are striking. They are so wide, they're so profound, that we can even build models to predict the income of the areas just based on how they use, for example, social media. Even, for example, we found that the people that in rich and poor areas, the people that live in less and high educated areas, they use internet for different type of games. So this is reflecting that it's not only about giving technology to people, is that actually the way they use technology is completely different. And the fact that, for example, fake news or access to opportunities, like, for example, jobs, etc., happen in fake news, for example, happen more in social media, or access to jobs, etc., happen more on news or in email. That means that the fact that these people see very different internet, most of the inequalities that we see are going to be exacerbated by how the people use these technologies. And this is something that is probably true also in vulnerable contexts and also in humanitarian settings. But one of the problems, and I think if you ever listen to a talk that is talking about the use of these massive data sets and mobile phone data, etc., and they don't talk about the problems that these data sets have, you are not listening to probably to 100% of the story, because this data is really biased. This data has a lot of problems. One of the main problems is that data and the models have a lot of drifting, meaning that the data that is collected today is probably going to be worthless in a month or 2 months. Most of the models and most of the applications of this data have to rely on a sustainable and constant use and reuse and remodel and retraining of the models. Otherwise, the models that you trained like 5 years ago probably going to be of no use today. Let me just show you 2 examples. And this is something that we are writing with people in UNICEF, is if these data-driven technologies are really are ready to be used for international development settings. For example, on the left, you have something that this is one of the main results that we have in our community, is that people that have more diverse mobility are better off. So basically, if you look at how people move and how people interact, more diverse communications, more diverse mobility is typically associated with more income. But what we found, for example, by looking at Twitter data in many different countries, and you have here, is that the correlation between development and mobility actually changes sign. It's very different in different countries. For example, you see here Colombia. In Colombia, you see the diversity is negatively correlated with development. But in other places, mobility is correlated other places which are actually very close to Colombia, they're basically the same context, geographical context, they have a different correlation. So that means that depending on the country that you are, the models are going to be relying on different variables, and they can even have different meaning. So that means that if I build a model in Colombia, most likely the model in Costa Rica, that model translated into Costa Rica is going to fail miserably. So that means that this data has, we have to be careful about applying this data in different cities. The other one is that if I train a model now, because the mobile phone operators and also the people that are producing this data are changing their habits, and I'm going to talk later about COVID, most likely what is going to happen that the model loses the performance, loses their ability to predict very quickly. So this is, for example, something that a collaborator, this is not our research, this is actually collaborators, they use mobile phone data in Iraq to predict socioeconomic status of people, and they found that in 4 months, the performance of the model dropped 30%. And the reason is because people are changing their behavior. Typically, the mobile phone company is collecting data in a different way, or they have a new technology. So this is very important to understand that the data and the models that you train today most likely are not going to be useful in a year or in a couple of years. Okay, and the final thing is that this data is very biased. And I'm pretty sure that, and the previous speaker was talking about that, the access to technology, the way people use technology, even the skills that people have to use the technology is going to impact who is actually represented in the data. And there are many, many biases in this data. Most of the biases are demographic or geographic. Like, for example, age, income, education, and race are very important because different socio-demographic groups have the different penetration in the use of technology, in the access to technology, but also in how they use technology. So, for example, typically, smartphones are available to higher income people, while feature phones are only available to low income people. And that creates, for example, a bias in the data that we have. Also, geographically, typically this data is better represented in urban spaces or in developing countries, while in urban settings or in rural settings and low income or high vulnerable settings, they're typically represented. They also, as I was saying, temporal biases. For example, there are changes in the operating systems, changes, for example, in the technology. For example, there are countries which are deploying right now 5G, while other places are still relying on 2G. So these things also create a lot of biases, and also behavioral biases. People are not using mobile phones for the same type of things. So, for example, there are people that are using more mobile phones when they are traveling. Some of them are using more mobile phones when they are shopping, etc. So that means that we are going to be having more behavioral biases. This is very important to understand that every data set that we collect, which is not designed like we are reusing this data. Typically, we reuse the data of mobile phone operators to understand these questions, and it's going to have these biases. And it's important to try to understand those biases as much as we can, and also to alleviate those biases. I'm not going to talk about this, but there are many techniques to alleviate those biases. For example, using surveys. I mean, typically you can use surveys to see what is the typical people that use those applications, the typical people that use those mobile phones, but also you can use other ground truth data. Most likely in the countries, you will have other data sets, either coming from the census or from statistical offices. And also you can do use other data sets. So our approach in our group always is complement the use of these data sets with either surveys or the official data coming from census. Even if it's very outdated or less frequent, you can always compare this data. So it's always good to alleviate or try to alleviate those biases, especially humanitarian crisis, especially humanitarian settings, because most likely the people that are going to be affected by those humanitarian crises or settings, or believing in those settings, is going to be the people that do not show up in the data, or are less likely to show up in the data. Let me finally comment a little bit on the kind of things that you can do with this data. We are not in the business of using this data to, for example, get better estimations of poverty, or get a more refined, let's say, census population, let's say the estimations of population, etc. Because I think there are many groups doing that and many companies which are doing that. We believe that the big data that we are using can actually approach us to ask new questions and actually understand more the roots of problems that we have in society, rather than just estimating metrics for example, for poverty or population in our studies. But of course, this data can be used for that, and there are many other people using this, and it's very useful in humanitarian settings. Let me tell you 3 projects that we have been doing, but I'm going to go very briefly through them. The first one is about understanding segregation. So segregation is one of the main problems that we have today in our societies, especially in developing countries, and also in developing countries. But in developing countries is one of the major problems. And segregation is not only the fact segregation is basically the idea that in our cities, in our societies, we are becoming less and less, more and more polarized, and we are living actually more and more away from other socio-demographic groups. So typically in the United States, you can see large areas of poor people living far away from large areas of rich people, and this is creating not only an ethical but a moral, let's say, problem in our society, but it's also becoming a problem for our democracies. For example, like people are becoming more polarized because we don't talk to neighbors which are very different from us. But obviously, the people that are living in the low-income areas are the ones which are suffering more this. For example, the people that live in low-income areas in the United States, they typically live 10 to 15 years less than high-income areas, which is huge. You can see, for example, cities like in the United States, like Chicago, in which people that are living half a mile away from each other, they live 10 to 15 years less than each other. So that's actually creating a lot of differences in that. But also, segregation has a cost for the whole society. The fact that we are living apart from each other is creating a cost, an economic cost for all of us, because societies that are highly segregated, they have higher homicide rates, they have a slower economic growth, and they tend to be less innovative in the future. So the fact that we are segregated is not only impacting the people which live in these slum-like poor areas, but it's impacting the rest of us, and it's impacting actually in the long run. So we have to do something to understand why people are segregated, how are people segregated, and if we can alleviate segregation in our societies in the future. So, but when typically people talk about segregation, they talk about places, they talk about where people live. Basically, it's the idea that you are where you live. And this is, for example, Mexico City. You can clearly see the 2 areas, which are separated by 10 meters. The one on the left is more slum-like. So you probably are guessing that this area has a low income, less educated people living there, etc. What the right-hand side, you have a more, let's say, order, more green, more, you see more canopy here, more trees, which is highly, you can imagine that this is more a high-income area. This is basically the picture that most agencies are using today to describe segregation is places. But this is not telling you what people on the left do, what people on the right do, and whether even the people living on the left and the people living on the right, maybe they come together in the same place. They work, for example, in the same school, or they work, for example, in the same I don't know, offices or in the same places. Most likely they are not, but they don't tell you that. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to understand in our cities, what is the behavior of the people, and whether that behavior of the people is actually also segregated beyond the places. So in order to do that, we partner with a mobile phone company, actually an app company that has data about mobile phones. And we have the trajectories, I mean, how people move around the city in 11 metropolitan areas. This is the metropolitan areas we have here. And we have around 4.8 million users. We have 6 months of data. So basically we have the trajectories of people around the day and the places that they visit. We match the trajectories to a data set of 1.2 million places, so we can identify when people were visiting a pizzeria or a pizza place, or if they were visiting, for example, an office, or they were going, for example, up to a park or to a restaurant. By doing that, we found the following thing is that around 75% of the time, we encounter people that live more than 15 kilometers away. Actually, only 3% of the people that we encounter, that we share a space in our cities, comes from the same block, from the same neighborhood. That means that if we are segregated, if we are actually living apart from each other, the question is where and why? I mean, because we are not segregated because we live in our neighborhoods. We are segregated probably because wherever we go, we decide to be segregated. But let's see how much we are segregated and the reason why we are segregated. So this is why we built a tool which is called the Atlas of Segregation, in which we mapped, the first thing that we did is we mapped the segregation of each of the public places in the United States. So this is Manhattan and this is New York. You can see here, each of the points that you see here is a place. It's a restaurant, it's a shop, it's a park, it's a headquarters office, etc. And the colors indicate how unequal, how diverse is the place. So very diverse places are colored in blue, and very unequal or less diverse places are marked in red. So that means that blue places are the places in which people from all over the income groups in the area, we are talking about segregation by income, go to that place, while places which are in red means that only one income group goes to those places. But you can clearly see things here which are, I mean, expected. Like, for example, downtown Manhattan, you have a lot of bluish points. And if you move to the neighborhoods, you have a lot of reddish points, meaning that those places are already visited by people in the neighborhood. But if you zoom in, you will always find that there are blue places close to red places. Okay, so you always find that there's a place which is highly segregated on the same street as a place which is highly mixed. Okay, so that means the segregation is not happening at the level of neighborhoods. It's actually happening at the level of places. So this is what we found. We found that even the different places have different segregation. This is the segregation. This is a plot in which we map on the vertical axis. We map the average segregation of all the places that belongs to a category in the United States, and in the horizontal axis we have the distance that people have to travel to get there. You see here things which are expected, like, for example, all the schools in the United States are highly segregated, are the places which are most segregated. Also, religious places like churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., are highly segregated. Also, things like, for example, grocery stores or supermarkets are highly segregated because they are very local. On the other extreme, you see things like, for example, museums, exhibits, even, for example, the airport, platforms, etc., which are highly integrated. This is the bottom right of the plot. Okay, and in the middle, you have a lot of variability. You have, for example, that even if you go to the working places, if you work in an office, you are less segregated, for example, than you work in a factory, in a warehouse. So that means that even depending on the type of things that you do in your life, you're going to be more or less segregated by choosing the different categories and the different places that you saw before. For example, you spend a lot of your time in elementary school, you are likely to be highly segregated, and the people that you are going to constantly be talking to, interacting with, and even making friendship with are going to be mostly like you. But if you work, for example, you are travel, or you work, for example, in an office, you are going to be less likely to be segregated, and you're going to interact with people from all over the place. Okay, the other thing that you can do is to try to identify the why people are segregated. So one of the things that we did is by looking at the places that people go, we can also investigate the individual segregation. We can start answering the question of how segregated is an individual. Okay, by looking at the places that you go and by looking at who goes to those places, I can actually identify what is your exposure to the different groups, the different sociodemographic groups that you have in the city. This is what we did. And what we found is actually that by looking at different models and by looking at how this individual segregation relies or is based on the different demographics and mobility and also behavioral features of the people, we found that only 45% of the segregation experienced by people is related to residential properties. Only, coming back to the original question, the individual segregation that people experience every day is not only about where you live. It's also encoded into the choices, the venues that you visit. Actually, you can see here that income, the people, does not tell you what is going to be your individual segregation. It's more encoded into the choices, the lifestyle that people have. And this is actually one thing that we are using now, because as you can imagine, changes people's residence. I mean, moving people from one place to another is really hard, but changing the choices they do, for example, for a coffee shop, is much easier. So this is something that we are going to do, and we are investigating what are the interventions that you can do in our societies that can change people behavior, not changing the residents, but change people behavior so that individual segregation is decreased. The other thing that I wanted to show you is how this data can be used in another, I wouldn't say humanitarian crisis, but another, let's say, it's also not a natural disaster, but another, let's say, another, let's say, situation which is very similar to a natural disaster, which was the recent COVID epidemics. So one of the things that you can use this data, the same data that we have, which is the mobility data of people going around in the city, is that because the data has a resolution of 5 meters, we can actually use that to get a proxy of what is the exposure of one person to another one. By looking at the different places that 2 people go to, we can basically build what is called the contact matrix, and we can build the probability that 2 persons get in contact. So that is very useful for modeling the epidemics, because if I know that 2 persons are likely to be in contact through the day, if one person gets infected, then I can study the probability how this or the probability that the other person gets infected, and I can model this and I can simulate the epidemic spread. This is what we did. What we did was to try to build, using this mobility data and also some other census areas data, we built what is called a multi-layer model, in which basically we have how different people in different contexts get together, whether it's the household, whether it's, for example, restaurants, schools, etc. And we build a model in which we simulate the epidemic spreading. And the good thing about having this simulation of the spreading at this level is that we can actually simulate the different effects of policies and the different effect of the epidemic spreading in the different groups and even in the different, for example, settings. This is the model that we have. It's a very complicated model for the COVID, but basically it's a comportamental model that can explain how you can go from susceptible, which is the biggest that you have here, through different probabilities. You can go even to the hospital, and you can unfortunately die because of COVID. So this is a model that was borrowed from the public health officials. We didn't invent the model, but what we did was to simulate that model in these networks by assuming that people are infected, and simulate how people get by looking at the contacts, how people can get how the epidemic can spread through those contact networks. One of the good things about these models and having this detailed data is that you can simulate the scenarios, and this is what we did last year to simulate the scenario of what could have happened if we deploy contact tracing in the Boston area, for example. And what we found is that if you deploy contact tracing, even if the contact tracing was not very good, like for example, just 20% of the contacts were traced, you could actually have flattened the curve and not having the second or the third waves in the Boston area. So that actually is telling you that if we have deployed contact tracing in, we actually could have reopen our society in a much ordered way and a much better way than what we did with the loss of lives, but also with a huge impact in economic economic impact, for example, in different groups. We can also, for example, do things like this. We can investigate which are the most risky places in which infections are happening. Using this data, we can see, for example, that New York and Seattle, they have a very different trajectories. People were talking, for example, in the United States, that restaurants were bad and that we should close the restaurants. No, restaurants were bad for spreading of the disease in New York, but not in Seattle. Okay, and that is the beauty of this data. You can actually go up to the resolution of even asking which are the places in which transmission is happening, and where are the places in which are more risky at a given time, at a given situation, in a given geographical context. And also, you can also do, for example, things like you can investigate other potential problems of lockdowns of the epidemic. For example, this is a project that we did with public health officials, in which we investigated the physical activity. Because we have the mobility of people, we can investigate how is the walking activity of people. And we could see, for example, that the walking activity during the lockdowns obviously decreased a lot, but once again, there were huge differences across groups. And what we found is that low-income people actually decreased their working activity much more. So this is the double pandemic, because low-income people were affected more by COVID, but also they decreased the physical activity more, which means that they're going to probably have more problems related to physical activity, to the lack of physical activity in the future. So this is another aspect that you can get from mobility data. And the final thing, which is probably more related to the context, to geographical context that you are interested with, is that you can also use this data. In this case, we are going to use credit card data coming from a bank, and this is a project that we did with the World Bank and Grand Data, in which we tried to investigate how unequal was the economic recovery in developing countries, like, for example, developed countries like Mexico. One of the interesting things about the COVID is that global wealth grew 7% in 2020. Even during the pandemic, the global wealth of people grew during the pandemic by 7.5%. And of course, not everybody was a winner. Not all the countries were a winner. For example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, actually it dropped. The global wealth during 2020 dropped 11.5%. So that means that even in the same situation, which is this COVID pandemic, different countries and different areas actually did very, very different. And especially it has been very unequal, even within a country, especially women and medium to small companies have been more affected by the COVID, because most of them closed, or they have been more affected, for example, in their employment than other people. The situation, for example, is that even in some of these countries, for example, in Latin America, they're actually less vaccinated than other countries. So even we have the situation that even though we don't talk about COVID anymore, because we have more pressing issues, like, for example, a war in Europe, these countries are still facing problems, or they could be facing problems in the future if new variants and new problems happen, or new, for example, pandemics happen in the future. So yes, we have been recovering from the COVID, and nobody's talking now about the implications, but we kind of see that there's a recovery paradox, especially in Latin American and Caribbean growth, because most of the countries in those areas, the recovery, the macro numbers are recovering, but most of the most vulnerable population in those countries have not. And this is what we wanted to do in Mexico. We wanted to do in Mexico because Mexico is a special place, because most of in Mexico, for example, during 2020, 9 million more people are in poverty situation. Mexico was one of the countries that was more affected by COVID deaths. Has the largest drop in GDP in 2020, although the unemployment was not changed. I mean, only 1% of the people were unemployed. I'm going to comment about that later. And Mexico is a very interesting country, because even though it was one of the countries more affected by the COVID situation, it was the country that did less in terms of stimulus. Only 1% of the GDP, only 2% of the GDP, less than 1/4 of all the Latin countries to support the economic recovery. So it was one of the countries most affected, but it was one of the countries that did less stimulus plans. For example, you can compare, for example, with the US, which is about 1/4 of the GDP was given in stimulus packages to the different people. So if there is a country in which an equal recovery was more important, it's probably Mexico. So this is what we studied. So what we did was to use data. We are actually creating a platform in which we are putting together data that comes from consumption, from a major bank in Mexico, data that comes from mobile phone to understand the mobility, data that comes from the census, from the statistical offices about the informality, about employment, and also about demographics. And we are putting them together to try to understand, using all this data, the different impact of the COVID recovery, the different impact of COVID, and the different unequal recovery of the different socio-demographic groups in Mexico. Let me just summarize some of the things that we found. is that we found, for example, this is the number of transactions, and we found that it was a huge drop in the number of transactions. For example, the high-income people drop during the first lockdown. They drop up to 40% their expenditure, the number of transactions, while the low-income people only decreased 28%. You can imagine that this is due to the fact that high-income people typically have spend money in non-essential goods, while low-income people, they don't have room for decreasing their income because most of the expenditure is actually based on essential goods. And we also found that females are the ones that during the first lockdown were decreased more their spending, but they eventually catch up and they have more or less the same spending. So low-income groups reduce their spending more than other countries. For example, in the US, the low-income groups didn't decrease much their spending. So that means that the reason could be, for example, the lack of a stimulus plan. The fact that the United States, 2 months or 3 months after the first lockdown, there was already stimulus checks given to low-income people, and this is why they didn't reduce their spending. The other thing that we found is that most of the places recover their spending. So the municipalities, the groups in municipalities, some of them recover, some of them don't. And this is the map that we found by female and income. So we found that, for example, 60% of female low-income groups have recovered their levels of spending. As I said, this is typically, the reason is because female low-income groups typically spend, all the expenditure is mostly due to essential goods, while only 46% of male high income have recovered their spending. And the reason is because typically these are professionals that travel a lot and they spend typically in non-essential goods. The other thing that we found is that not all the purchases were affected. For example, in Mexico, after the lockdown, the spending in groceries increased. The reason is because we have the substitute effect between food and the groceries. So the people that were having food outside, they're staying home and they have to get more groceries. But and also, for example, we saw that traveling was highly reduced and transportation was highly reduced. Transportation, for example, having recovered, but other categories like, for example, health or shopping has recovered after the thing. So that tells you that people not only have decreased their spending, but also have changed the way they were spending money. And I don't have the data here to show you, but we have in the platform, we're going to have also how different groups for different geographies changing their spending. Typically low-income people, they basically reduce a lot of their expenditure in transportation, while high-income people reduce the spending typically in food and also in traveling. The final thing that we found is that how this was the initial impact. So people basically, because of the lockdown, reduced the consumption a lot. But there was a secondary impact, is that the reduction in consumption actually translated into unemployment. And the reason is because if people don't go to food places, the people that were working on those food venues were actually laid off, and then they were displaced and they didn't have a job. So what we found is that, and this is very important for the point of policy, is that 1% change in spending translated into 0.5% change in employment. So every time we have a lockdown, and this is actually something that we found in Mexico, that the lockdown, the fact that people stay home, impacted the spending. People were spending less, but that translated into unemployment in the long run. And once again, the people that were more affected in the long run, even if they don't decrease their spending in the first lockdowns, what we found is that people that were more affected again were low-income people. So in the long run, the pandemic, what happened is that the high-income people decreased their spending. They were not displaced; they were still having their jobs, but that translated into people in low-income communities that were displaced and they lost their jobs. So that's the very unequal and the very paradox. And the paradox that we have in the recovery is that the macro numbers are okay, but the low-income people have been displaced and have lost their, not only the expenditure power, but also the jobs. Let me just finalize by having this. I always finalize with this job, is that what we can, how we can use this data to inform policies in the future is that, or to use in humanitarian settings, is that, let me give you, obviously, there are many ways to do that, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. For example, we are working with the World Bank in Mexico to try to understand what could have happened if the stimulus checks or there was a stimulus policies in Mexico, which are the groups which are that are more affected by that you should actually target, etc. But let me finalize with the idea that the data that we have, this big data that we have, and the data coming from mobile phones, from credit card, can inform us better about contacts, about interactions, about encounters, about how people move, how people consume, etc. And can actually tell us more about how interconnected is the society, how interdependent is the society, and can tell us, for example, what is the difference between the materials you have on the left and the materials you have on the right. These materials are, one is graphite and the other one is diamond. They're based on the same element, which is carbon, and the only difference between them is the network, is how the atoms are connected. So we believe that by mapping those connections and by using this big data that we have today, we can map the connections between the different people in the cities, and we can make more robust societies that can be less impacted by natural disasters, by humanitarian crises, but also, for example, by epidemics. And I'm happy to finish there. You have a reference about the papers that we and the things that we have published. And I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for taking extra time.
Profesor Esteban, muchísimas gracias por su presentación bastante clara y concreta sobre los ejemplos que nos iba presentando a lo largo de su explicación. Tenemos un par de preguntas de nuestros asistentes y espectadores en el evento del día de hoy, se las voy a transmitir. La primera sería, ¿cómo puede obtener acceso a la información del teléfono móvil para realizar este tipo de análisis? ¿Necesita tener un acuerdo con las compañías telefónicas?
Sí, afortunadamente nosotros hemos trabajado mucho con compañías y una de las partes, bueno, lo voy a hacer en español. No sé si lo hago en español o en inglés. No sé.
Tranquilo, profesor, como usted prefiera. Como bueno, usted prefiera.
Voy a hacerlo en español, ya que la pregunta es en español. Afortunadamente llevamos mucho tiempo trabajando con empresas y hemos visto cambiar mucho la manera de operar con este tipo de datos. Muchos de los operadores de telefonía móvil tienen acuerdos, tienen plataformas, tienen iniciativas en las que permiten la utilización de estos datos para social good, para procesos o para fenómenos o para experiencias de ayudar a la sociedad. Y tenemos colaboraciones también con agentes, por ejemplo, con UNICEF, con Data Collaboratives, con United Nations, etcétera, en los que estas compañías ceden estos datos en situación. Lo que hemos visto, por ejemplo, durante el COVID, es muchas empresas han permitido el acceso a estos datos. Nosotros tenemos la suerte de colaborar con empresas que tienen ese tipo de iniciativas. Y es importante que exista este tipo de iniciativas porque, como dije antes, el acceso sostenido a este tipo de datos es muy importante para no solamente, porque lo que no queremos hacer es hacer modelos que sirvan un año, sino lo que queremos hacer son modelos, estudios que puedan permitir el estudio continuado longitudinal de este tipo de problemas, y para eso necesitamos trabajar con empresas que permitan el acceso a este tipo de datos. Evidentemente, el acceso a este tipo de datos tiene una problemática porque estas empresas, aunque algunas de ellas tienen una línea de negocio que está asociada al uso de los datos en desastres humanitarios y en situaciones de vulnerabilidad, etcétera, no todas tienen no todas hacen negocio con este tipo de datos en esas situaciones y, por tanto, hay que estar expectante siempre a que pues, la empresa desaparezca o la empresa cambie el tipo de datos, etcétera. Pero, bueno, yo en particular, para el caso nuestro, si hay alguien interesado, yo le puedo poner en contacto con la empresa con la que trabajamos, con las empresas con las que trabajamos, y también con el tipo de manera que la que trabajamos con ellas, que siempre es una manera que evidentemente es conservando la privacidad, conservando los aspectos éticos y legales, y es cosa que es muy importante, sobre todo en en algunos contextos geográficos y temporales.
Muchas gracias, profesor Esteban. La segunda pregunta está relacionada con una de las afirmaciones que hizo sobre el consumo de redes sociales que indican menos educación y más nivel de pobreza. La pregunta se orienta a si podríamos saber qué variables o qué información se utilizan para sacar esas conclusiones.
Perdón, es que me estaba leyendo la pregunta y pensé que era la pregunta que estaba en el Q&A. ¿Me lo puedes responder? ¿Me lo puedes repetir?
Claro que sí, no hay ningún problema. La pregunta está relacionada con una de las afirmaciones en relación al estudio que hace en la que correlaciona justamente redes sociales con consumo. Entonces, hay una afirmación a lo largo, digamos, de la presentación y es entre más consumo de redes sociales, menos educación y más nivel de pobreza. El espectador pregunta, ¿podríamos saber qué variables o qué información utilizan para sacar esas conclusiones?
Sí, no entro en los detalles, muchas gracias. Y es un estudio que hemos hecho con un operador en Francia, Orange, un operador de telefonía móvil, en donde el dato que tenemos es el tráfico de las diferentes aplicaciones y de los diferentes servicios a través de antena. Entonces, lo que tenemos es cuál es el volumen, por ejemplo, de datos que la gente utiliza de YouTube o de la gente utiliza de redes sociales o que la gente utiliza del email o de los periódicos, por ejemplo. Y lo que vemos es que normalizando este consumo, es decir, todo el mundo consumimos YouTube, todo el mundo consumimos Netflix, en estos países, normalizando por el uso medio de la gente, lo que vemos es que los sitios que hay más pobreza utilizan de manera mucho más frecuente las redes sociales. Los sitios que tienen mucho menos nivel educativo utilizan muchísimo más de manera relativa a las redes sociales y utilizan, por ejemplo, muchísimo más YouTube Stream o utilizan, por ejemplo, mucho más Facebook. Ese es lo que hemos visto ahí, es el tráfico por área. Lo que tenemos es el tráfico agregado por área en esas zonas. Y lo que vemos es que las zonas que tienen más nivel educativo, que tienen más ingresos, son las zonas en donde se utiliza menos de manera relativa los vídeos en YouTube, el Facebook, las redes sociales, y se utiliza de manera relativa más herramientas como, por ejemplo, el email, como las noticias, como los periódicos o como las búsquedas, por ejemplo, en Google. El dato viene de la telefónica, viene de la compañía telefónica y viene de la inspección de los paquetes, de los datos que utilizamos en nuestros móviles.
Profesor Esteban, muchas gracias, muy clara su respuesta. La tercera pregunta que tenemos preparada para usted es si existe alguna estrategia o algún tipo de actividad que pueda socializar sobre cómo mitigar los procesos de las mediciones de incidencias en un antes y un después de intervención en una población migrante que suele perder sus números de teléfono o sus teléfonos móviles por diferentes motivos. Entendiendo que justamente esto es una barrera que las organizaciones humanitarias enfrentan casi que a diario.
Sí, bueno, eso es una... De hecho, en el grupo nuestro, en el MIT, hemos trabajado en dos problemas de migrantes con la ayuda de datos de telefonía móvil. Uno ha sido el contexto de la migración siria hacia Turquía, que eso hace unos años, y también hemos trabajado en la migración de venezolanos hacia Colombia. Una de las cosas que evidentemente, como bien señala Yenelsa, perdona si no pronuncio bien tu nombre, es que no tenemos datos del antes y después, es decir, no tenemos datos de la telefonía en Siria y no tenemos datos de la telefonía en Turquía, por ejemplo. Entonces no podemos hacer el contexto del antes y después de una intervención, o sea, del antes y después de la migración. Pero sí lo que podemos hacer es existen métodos para intentar detectar cuando una persona que tiene un teléfono móvil, una persona que tiene un número de teléfono, existen algoritmos bastante eficaces para detectar que esa persona es un migrante. Es porque las personas que son migrantes tienen diferentes patrones de movilidad, tienen diferentes interrelaciones con las personas del país y tienen diferentes relaciones entre ellos. Entonces hay algoritmos muy precisos para detectar que una persona es un inmigrante, cosa que tampoco tenemos datos. Es decir, una persona cuando coge un teléfono móvil no dice que es un inmigrante. Aunque el operador lo conozca, tampoco podemos a veces acceder a ese dato, ¿no? Y entonces eso es lo que podemos hacer. Entonces, por ejemplo, en el caso del contexto de los migrantes sirios en Turquía y de los migrantes venezolanos en Colombia, es muy fácil detectar que una persona es un migrante venezolano o un migrante sirio en ese contexto. Y ahí es donde podemos ver, haciendo la trazabilidad de esas personas que ya viven, por ejemplo, en Turquía con los migrantes sirios, podíamos ver intervenciones, por ejemplo, alrededor de la frontera humanitarias, hacia dónde iban, etcétera, qué zonas, por ejemplo, tenían más receptivas a los inmigrantes sirios en Turquía y medir cómo era la interacción de esas personas en diferentes zonas respecto a las diferentes políticas. Es decir, sí existe posibilidad de que una vez que se ha identificado que esa persona es un migrante, poder hacer la trazabilidad y poder medir el efecto de las políticas en diferentes políticas en esa población.
Perfecto, profesor Esteban, muchas gracias. Una última pregunta para cerrar esta conferencia. Está relacionada justamente con el estudio comparado en torno a los restaurantes. Y la pregunta es, ¿por qué los restaurantes eran más peligrosos en Nueva York que en Seattle?
Sí, una cosa es importante porque el ingrediente principal de nuestro estudio es que incorporamos el comportamiento de la gente. Incorporamos qué gente se queda en casa, qué gente no se queda en casa, qué gente va a los restaurantes, qué gente no. Entonces, ¿por qué los restaurantes en Nueva York es más peligrosos que en Seattle? Es porque la mayoría de la gente que va a restaurantes en Seattle va a restaurantes en su zona. Va a restaurantes. Seattle es una ciudad muy suburbana, mientras que Nueva York es una ciudad muy urbana. La gente que va a restaurantes en Nueva York viene de muchos sitios. Va a Manhattan, por ejemplo, a la isla de Manhattan, y allí va a los restaurantes. Todos los restaurantes en Nueva York fueron más peligrosos porque la gente que va a esos restaurantes viene de muchísimos sitios muy diferentes y por tanto puede traer o puede importar el riesgo de transmisión de la enfermedad de muchos sitios, mientras que los restaurantes en Seattle son más locales y por tanto si no hay ningún caso en la zona, pues no lo van a importar o no lo van a transmitir porque no hay este caso. Por eso, y luego además en Seattle el número de casos que hubo fue un poquito antes que el número de Nueva York. Entonces, cuando la gente dejó de ir a los restaurantes, se volvieron menos peligrosos que los restaurantes en Nueva York. Por eso es importante entender que no existe, si uno estudia el comportamiento de la gente, es posible acercarse a responder ese tipo de cuestiones o incluso tomar políticas que sean mucho más dirigidas a tomar acciones que sean mejor para disminuir el número de casos que cerrar todos los restaurantes. Es una medida que tiene un impacto social, económico e incluso desde el punto de vista epidémico muy fuerte. O sea, mucha gente perdió su trabajo y mucha gente y muchos negocios tuvieron que cerrar porque todos los restaurantes en todas las ciudades en Estados Unidos prácticamente cerraron.
Profesor Esteban, muchísimas gracias por su presentación, por su conferencia. El profesor Esteban es científico de datos y profesor de la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid en España y profesor visitante del MIT, del Media Lab y el MIT Connection Science en IDS. Muchísimas gracias por su presentación, profesor. Las personas que estén interesadas se pueden comunicar directamente con usted. Ahí encuentran en el slide los datos de contacto del profesor. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias de nuevo por acompañarnos dentro de este espacio. Esperamos poder seguir ampliando esta conversación en eventos futuros. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a todos. Que pasen buen resto del día.